This is episode 9 of season 1 of Babylon 5, Deathwalker. Good name. This isn't an ARC episode, but it has the feel of an ARC episode for me, and I was actually surprised when I discovered that it wasn't one, from what I remembered of it. So, let's get into it. We begin with Talia having, rather surprisingly, a meeting with Kosh. And Kosh explains that he wants her to supervise a business meeting for him. Talia asks him what sort of meeting it will be, and he says, important. This is like full-on classic enigmatic cryptic Kosh, basically, as you'd expect. And apparently the meeting is going to be in Red 3 at the hour of scampering. Yes, I said the hour of scampering. I'm not making this up. That apparently is a time that means something to Kosh. It doesn't mean anything to the rest of us, but presumably somehow Talia found out what it meant. Meanwhile, there is a Minbari flyer on approach to the station's docking bay, and in the arrivals lounge, a tannoy mentions Jupiter colonies, which suggests that Earth's got quite a few colonies in the solar system. I think we've established Mars now as well, so we know that we've pretty much developed the solar system as we currently know it. And Natoth comes in and uses a console to query when a transport is going to be arriving. Apparently Transport Callisto is due in 7 minutes, but she doesn't look terribly impressed by this arrival time, despite it not being that long. She looks around the arrivals lounge and she sees a woman boarding the station, looks more closely at her, then suddenly shouts Deathwalker, and basically closes in on her fast and knocks her to the ground, pushes her back into the cargo bay sort of area, and then starts beating the snot out of her with a wrench. Welcome to Babylon 5, whoever the hell you are. It's a pretty full-on nasty vicious attack, and it takes 2 security officers to pull her back and get her off the woman who's arrived, who's now lying prone on the floor, not surprisingly. Sinclair and Garibaldi discuss the attack, and Garibaldi notes that both her ship and her clothes suggest a Minbari background, but she's clearly no Minbari. Both, however, have heard the name Deathwalker before, and so they go on to go and speak with Natoth about what happened. Natoth explains that she attacked the woman because of a Shankar, a blood oath. The Dilgar conquered a planet called Hylax 7, and her family suffered greatly as a result. And this Deathwalker experimented on her grandfather and putting a machine in his brain that slowly killed him. But this was 30 years ago, and so we don't really understand how this woman could possibly be the same woman, because she'd be an old woman by now. And so Sinclair and Garibaldi are both puzzled by this, but Natoth is adamant that the image of this woman is basically seared on her mind, and that her entire family has sworn a blood oath to kill this woman on sight, and that's basically what she was trying to do. So Jakar comes in, apologises to the commander for his aide's behaviour, and a compromise is reached whereby she will remain with him under house arrest in his quarters, basically. So we then see Kosh starting to have his meeting with Talia, and Talia says that she doesn't understand why she's there, to which Kosh replies that understanding is a 3-edged sword. And I've always quite liked that saying. It's sort of their side, your side, and the truth, basically. So Abbott arrives to the negotiations. We don't know anything about him. He's a sort of short, jovial chap with a big hat, and he's sort of delighted to see Talia there. Kosh asks Talia to scan him, which she does, but she's puzzled by the results of her scan, and she describes his mind as being empty. And it seems that Kosh is very happy to hear that, and so negotiations begin. Back in Medbay, Franklin's team can't pin down which species Deathwalker belongs to, but one thing that is clear is that she's healing rapidly just by herself. Sinclair arrives at the room and identifies her as a Dilgar, and he then goes on to look at historical records for the Dilgar with Franklin, and that in the Earth Alliance year 2230, which is 28 years prior, Dilgar's sun went nova, and virtually none of them were left after they attempted an invasion of the non-aligned sectors. Deathwalker was also known as War Master Jadur, leader of the Dilgar invasion, and she's been missing since 2232, according to the screen. Sinclair says that his father flew for Earth Force during the invasion when they retook Balos, and that he never forgot what he saw there. Meanwhile, Sinclair is told that Senator Hidoshi is on the Gold Channel for him. That's the sort of premium, secure channel that Earth uses to communicate with the station. In Jakar's quarters, he's sympathetic with Natoth's need for vengeance, but explains that the Narn she was going to meet was actually due to meet with Jadur because she's made a discovery that the Narn regime would very much like to get their hands on. Natoth helpfully says that she will take it from her as she eats her flesh. Jakar isn't massively impressed by that as a concept because he really wants whatever it is that she's got. And so Natoth grudgingly agrees to delay but not remove the Shankar to support the regime's goals. Jakar supports her in that as a concept, and it's quite a nice moment between the two of them because he says that when the time comes he will help her to fulfill her blood oath. In Sinclair's office, Earth now wants Jadur as well, apparently. And Sinclair is told in no uncertain terms that is what's going to happen, basically. In Medbay, Jadur recovers consciousness and takes the vial that Garibaldi found on her ship off Franklin and demands to speak with Sinclair, saying that this is her life's work. And on his way to meet with her, Sinclair has to fob Londo off because he's got wind of Deathwalker being on the station, and so is very keen to find out more. In Medbay, Jador's gotten dressed, and when Sinclair arrives, she's quite impressed by him in a way, I think. And she says that the wind swords have been sheltering her for a number of years now, and the wind swords are a Minbari caste that Sinclair was very familiar with because he was engaged with them over the course of the events of the Gathering. And she references here the hole in his mind that the wind swords say that he has. As we saw in the previous episode, that's very relevant for him right now. It turns out that she has developed a universal anti-agapic, basically a youth serum, that also guards against disease, so it's immortality in a bottle. It's unstable and it's difficult to synthesize, but it does work, and she herself is living proof, which explains why she looks so much younger than she should and why she's recovered from Natoth's rather vicious attack so rapidly. Elsewhere, the gobbledygook negotiations between Abbott and Kosh are drawing to a close for the day, and apparently they will start again at the hour of longing. Talia speaks to Kosh and tries to understand what on earth is going on because it's all gibberish to her, and he says that if she seeks meaning she should listen to the music and not the song. She also asks Abbott what's going on, and he offers to get her a drink, a Jovian sunspot, saying it's good to reflect, which triggers a really strong reaction, and Talia sees herself in a hall of mirrors in her mind's eye. And after that, they part ways. Delenn, it turns out, is off station during this episode, so Sinclair speaks to Lanier about the Wind Swords and Deathwalker. He says that the Wind Swords are the most militant of the warrior caste. Lanier says he can ask Delenn for any information the council has, although he's surprised that even Wind Swords might harbour her, given what he knows about of being something of a history buff, it turns out. Jakar tries to outbid Earth for the anti-agapic with Jadur, but in order to secure the bargain, she would want Natoth's head within the hour. Literally, her head on a plate within the hour, effectively. She actually looks rather like an evil version of an Avatar alien. I can't remember what they were called now, Nari or something. I think it's the eye contact lens and the ears or something. Just the way she grins is just she's a nasty piece of work. And Garibaldi can't believe that they're seriously entertaining taking a deal with her, given the devastation that she's wrought as War Master. She's infected entire planets with plague just to see how long it took to kill everyone, and done various other nasty. So she's very, very good with cyber organics and disease manipulation and mutation, all that nasty stuff. Sinclair says it's just not something they can handle on the station, regardless of the morality of the situation, and holds out hope that her serum might repair some of the damage that she's wrought. G'Kar knows Sinclair is going to move her, though, and he places a call to one of the League ambassadors, Colica, because he likes to play this sort of game. So Sinclair is now ready to take her to a ship. She says she wants her serum to be a monument to a now dead race, when Sinclair presses her over why she wants to give it to Earth. She thinks it will be a delightful irony that the other races will now want to thank the Dilgar for all eternity. Sinclair is intercepted en route, however, and it's a standoff with the League. So he has to agree to an assembly in 3 hours to discuss whether or not she can be tried for her crimes on the station. And that's obviously what G'Kar was hoping for when he placed his call moments earlier. Elsewhere, negotiations begin again. And again, Talia has a sort of flashback when Abbott engages her and asks her a question. In the council chambers, Sinclair thinks that the League will get the final say on the vote. The Narn and the Centauri won't go for it because they helped the Dilgar, but it'll end up deadlocked with Earth and Minbar in favour. Sinclair says to Londo he wanted it handled quietly, which is why he didn't tell him anything about it earlier. Looking around the manic chambers, Mallory says, "Great job!" So Colica, on behalf of the League of Non-Aligned Worlds, asks that the Advisory Council vote to put Deathwalker on trial for crimes against sentience on Babylon 5 as soon as possible. Londo votes no, because she hasn't committed any crime against the Centauri. G'Kar banters with Londo about that, and then demands that Deathwalker be tried on Narn. But the League can't accept that, given the Narn don't really have clean hands with her either, and that gives G'Kar an excuse to vote no. Kosh abstains from the proceedings, so his vote doesn't count. Sinclair votes yes, but to his surprise, Lanier takes a line similar to Londo's, that the Minbari haven't been harmed by her, and votes no. And Sinclair had assumed that the Minbari, being honourable, would vote that she should be tried. So you can see he's quite shocked by that as a position. So the League withdraw from the assembly meeting in protest, accusing the other major powers of sidelining them. Lanier feels the need to explain to Sinclair, and basically the Minbari government didn't know the Windsors were sheltering Jadur until the Earth-Minbari War, when she produced weapons for the Windsors as part of the war effort, and the Minbari now wish to keep the fact secret out of shame that she was allowed to do so in the first place. So they wanted to stay buried, basically, which is why they don't want her to go on a and be trialled in public. The scene then shifts to outside the station, and we see a Drazi Sunhawk cruiser come out of the jump gate and threatening to attack the station unless Deathwalker is handed over to them. Babylon 5 locks its own weapons as it itself is targeted, and the Sunhawk comes into range to fire. And Ivanova tells the Drazi captain that he'll find the guns quite impressive for a few seconds, at which point he then pauses to reconsider his tactical options. And the Ikshar and the Vree send ships in too, so it's party time in the local space outside the station, basically. Sinclair meets with Colica to try and defuse the situation, and Ivanova has the ship captains debating who has the better claim over Deathwalker to try and slow them down. This time when Kosh and Talia meet again, Kosh actually evokes a really sort of terrifying experience and memory in her. And Abbott at this point reveals that underneath his hat is a sort of cybernetically enhanced brain, and from it he removes a data crystal that Kosh's suit retrieves using a little manipulator arm. Talia asks what's on it, and Kosh tells her reflection, surprise, terror for the future. So Talia is very disturbed by this, of course, and the scene shifts to Sinclair in conversation with the League again, and he's seeking a deal which would allow Deathwalker to develop the serum on Earth with League supervision, and that they would then hand her over. He doesn't have clearance for that with Earth, but he thinks that once it's made public, they'll have no choice but to agree to it. And he explains that this isn't a council decision. This would be a deal between the Earth and the League, just like when they helped the League defeat the Dilgar. So the League do agree to this, and they withdraw their ships back and send them home. And Deathwalker interestingly puts her War Master uniform back on, and in doing so she reveals her trump card to Sinclair, that the critical ingredient in the anti-agapic requires the death of another entity, and so she believes the races will become just like the Dilgar and fall upon each other like wolves to get what they need to secure immortality, and that will be her monument to her race's departure. So we see that the ambassadors have gathered to watch her flyer leave, when Kosh unexpectedly joins them. I think there's a bit of a glitch here, because they're watching her flyer go on the monitor, and we see that the jump gate, the vortex as it's sometimes referred to, is active for an incoming ship, but in space it actually isn't yet. However, that does soon change, and command and control say that something is coming in as Deathwalker is preparing to head out. As it turns out, the thing that's coming in is a Vorlon cruiser, and it ends Deathwalker. Takes them about one shot to get a feel for her range, and the next shot finishes her. And Sinclair asks Kosh why, to which Kosh replies in his typically enigmatic way, "You are not ready for immortality." Now Toth is happy, of course, as is pretty much everyone else in the League actually, because in effect Kosh has simply served a death sentence on her, and at the same time has wiped out any possibility of the serum being fought over by the other races. So we had no clue that he was going to do that ahead of time, but clearly he was monitoring events as they were happening, even though he was busy negotiating with Talia and Abbott at the time as well. Talia then joins Garibaldi and Sinclair on the promenade as they discuss the outcome of events, to say that she may have a problem with Ambassador Kosh, to which Garibaldi says join the club. Talia explains what she went through, and that 4 years ago she scanned a serial killer on Mars, and it was terrifying, and she had those thoughts brought back today, but not as nightmares, as actual living memory. Garibaldi knows Abbott. He describes him as a funny little guy with a big hat and likes Jovian sunspots. He's a vicar, a VCR from old Earth slang, a cyber organic who can record pretty much anything, including thoughts. So Talia was apparently set up by Kosh, because the Vorlons are wary of telepaths, although it's not explained why. So it may be that he wanted some insurance, something that he can use against her in future if need be. Garibaldi comments that Kosh has been a busy boy today. So, as I said at the beginning, this felt like an arc episode, because there are lots and lots of politics going on, and very sort of interesting, nuanced, seemingly completely unrelated subplot with Talia and Kosh, and the Deathwalker sort of plot line also that then ties back to the Gathering as well, because we know that the Windswords were quite rogue in terms of Minbari behaviour, which makes sense because presumably only they would have even vaguely considered hiding her away for 20-30 years. I think it's a really good episode, and it's interesting. We see some of the League ships for the first time here, so we haven't really seen any other alien races ships apart from Minbari and the Soul Hunter, I think, up to this point. That's been pretty much it. Oh, and the odd Centauri passenger liner as well. But here we see League warships for the first time, so it's clear that there is a certain amount of firepower out there, and that they're not afraid to use it. It's probably one of the few times we've seen Babylon 5 directly challenged on a sort of a war stance, and obviously the defense grid comes online to counteract it, and it does give the Drazi warship pause for thought. But it's not really clear to what extent it could actually hold its own against a larger force. So it's interesting because it establishes that Babylon 5 can defend itself if it so chooses, and obviously it would need to, and we know that the Star Furies can launch, but I would imagine that although Star Furies are probably on sort of hot standby most of the time to some extent, the defense grid is actually their fastest response when something unexpected happens. This is interesting in terms of seeing how the Babylon 5 Advisory Council works. So we have Minbari, Narn, Earth, Vorlons, and the League. So in theory, most decisions would go down to a sort of 3-2 kind of vote, but because Kosh isn't around a lot of the time there is a sort of deadlock. And as we saw in this episode, if three of the major powers decide that they don't want something to happen, then it ain't going to happen. So even though Earth and the League were in favour of something happening, the Minbari, the Narn, and the Centauri can block it. So I guess that's sort of fair enough, and this also reflects, I think, the funding of the station as well, so that everyone's got a stake in it. But it does mean that there is a real issue with the sort of the potential for deadlock in this whole sort of situation, and this is something that could derail the entire project, because if the League, for example, do feel particularly sidelined at any point, then they could simply just leave, and the whole thing would then fall apart, because it's apparent that the League are quite numerous. So you see, there are far more seats for the non-aligned worlds section than there are for the major powers, but they've only got the one vote on the council, despite there being lots of different races involved on that side of things. So it's quite an interesting dynamic, because there are a lot of voices and a lot of noise coming from the League of Non-Aligned Worlds, but unless they themselves can get their act together and actually decide on a single course of action, they're quite fragmented. So Sinclair does have a real job on his hands trying to marshal all this and keep everyone talking, but he demonstrates in this episode that he is capable of doing that. And so in that respect, it's quite a thoughtful episode, because Sinclair does play it very cleverly, because he knows that he can, in effect, sort of flummox his own government into going down the route that he wants them to go without actually having got their permission in the first place. So there's a lot of quite sort of off the cuff sort of diplomacy going on here to try and make the situation work for all concerned. But it's also very interesting how Jador is going to try and turn that on them all as well. So by giving them immortality, her goal was actually to cause chaos, and so the cost of that immortality will be very, very high, and might result in entire civilizations being razed to the ground. So she was a really interesting character in that sense, because she was clearly brilliant, but clearly completely twisted as well from pretty much everyone else's point of view. And it was interesting as well, I thought, that the League wanted her tried for crimes against sentience. It's not against any one sort of given race necessarily, but just generally, because not so much the concept of human rights, but the concept of rights of living beings in general. So that's a nice distinction, I think, that it reflects a very non-human centric view of the universe, which has to be right in the context of a diplomatic station for multiple alien races. It makes perfect sense. So it's a solid episode. It's there's a bit of action in it. There's Natoth being incredibly vicious, but at the same time having very much a sort of almost a sort of spiritual side to her, and a really nice bond forming between her and Jakar as well. So there's character development, there's action, there's politics, power plays. It's all good stuff, even though it's technically a non-arc episode, so you don't sort of have to watch it for arc purposes. But I think it would be a shame not to, because it's a good episode. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'll see you for the next one.